Welcome to Backlash Unfiltered, a podcast series by Unrest. Through in-depth conversations with leading scholars, activists, and policymakers, we will explore the rise of anti-gender movements, their impact on social development, and the historical and geopolitical forces that sustain them. This series is not just about understanding the backlash. It is also about resilience and imagining a fairer future.
Welcome to this episode of Backlash Unfiltered. My name is Anna Eknor-Axel, and I'm a research analyst with the Gender Justice and Development team here at Unrest. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Dr. Yanina Welp to explore the challenges facing democracy today, from the global democratic decline to the backlash against women's and LGBTQIA+ rights, and the new forms of citizen participation emerging in response. Dr. Welp is a research fellow at the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. She specializes in democratic innovations, participatory politics, and the impact of digital technologies on civic life. Her recent work include The Will of the People, Populism and Citizen Participation in Latin America, and co-editing the De Gruyter Handbook of Citizens' Assemblies. Yanina, thank you very much for being here. I am very excited to dive into this conversation with you.
Thank you, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you. So to kick off, could you please set the stage for us and describe the current global trends in democratic decline? What are we looking at?
Important point to start is to understand that the democratic decline is not just a regional issue, but a global phenomenon. And I would like to quickly mention 6 points that I think are really important to understand this democratic decline. The first is that there was an historical over-optimism about democratization. I think the assumption that liberal democracy was the end of history underestimated the persistence of authoritarian resilience and the cyclical nature of political systems. Then going more in depth on what is going on, I would mention the geopolitical shift undermining democratic momentum. And of course, we have to think in the US, in China and Russia. The US decline of hegemony, the US hegemony decline has weakened the liberal world order. The rise of China shows alternatives, combining state capitalism and authoritarianism. And then Russia, of course, is an aggressive authoritarianism that further destabilizes democracies. My third point would be that the democratic backsliding happens in established and emerging democracies. And we have plenty of examples. Just to mention 2 dimensions, I could quote erosion of institutions, and we have seen this in countries like Poland or Hungary, but also the attacks to media freedom, like in Turkey or India, and also free elections, like in Venezuela. So we have this picture coming from countries in all the world. And of course, the emergence of populist leaders undermining norms. Fourth point I would like to put on the table is the internal pressures in Western democracies. And these days, we are observing that at the level of the European Union, for instance, with the tension between securitization versus rights. So we have the counterterrorism policies, migration policies, a huge set of policies that are to somehow weakening civil liberties. Polarization and distrust, also a common topic, is happening in Western democracies and around the world. And then a third point, which is not in this item, internal pressures in democracies, is the youth disillusionment. I think it's not enough mentioned, and it's very important, particularly for our conversation also. Then my fifth point is the authoritarian tools and transnational repression. We are observing the digital authoritarianism exported globally by China, and also the disinformation and cyber attacks, and Russia as a prominent actor on that. And my very final point, which is a classical one, and again, I think is a fundamental one, is that there are structural barriers to democratization. And this refers to mainly economic inequality, this is very important, weak institutions, and elite resistance. I think this elite resistance is also a component we have to take into account when talking about democratic backsliding. A quite pessimistic picture, I know, but this is a starting point.
Yes, I would say it's a very realistic and eloquently dissecting of the democratic decline. So thank you so much for that overview. And it brings me very neatly into my next question for you, which is, of course, the focus of our series. How does this then relate to backlash, specifically the backlash against women's and LGBTQIA plus rights?
Yeah, this is a central question because for many, and particularly if we look at the studies on populism, the classical studies on populism, gender was not an issue at all, was not considered in a dimension. And now I think particularly from feminists or gender scholars doing this kind of studies, we are aware that gender is at the core of the populist narrative and is central. And if
Yes.
we look at the backlash, I think there are, again, I mean, I'm always trying to structure my thoughts in levels or dimensions to understand it. And I feel that it's fundamental to understand these two dimensions. One, which is more related to the cultural backlash, I mean, the rejection of the diversity and pluralism, the anti-woke politics, let's say, which is
Right.
this. I mean, yeah, it's more than a cultural dimension, but I think probably for most of the audience will be clear what I mean by that. It's more related to the notion of family, the traditional values, or this narrative, which is at the core of
Yes.
I mean, this mobilization of the conservatives and radical right. There is a second dimension, which is overlapping and connecting, which is the rejection of the state. In many countries now, and of course this is overlapping, but it's a different thing and not always go together, these two dimensions. The notion of the state as an actor with a central role in guaranteeing rights. I mean, democratic backsliding often involves attacks on state mechanisms that protect marginalized groups. And probably a prominent example of that at the moment is Milei in Argentina. You can observe that there is a narrative which is absolutely conservative and from the extreme right, but then it's also a narrative which says, okay, you do whatever you want, but the state doesn't need to be at the center in guaranteeing these rights. So I think the backlash comes from these two different axes, which quite often overlaps, but need to be understood in each one in its dimension.
Let's zoom in on some of the connected topics. I'd like to start off with asking you how this all relates to alternative mechanisms of civic engagement in response then to the backlash.
Yes, this is I mean, absolutely central question because, of course, even if we say this realistic or pessimistic the narrative, we should always be aware and stress that there are a lot of things that can be done to counteract these negative trends or these trends against rights and pluralism and diversities. And I think there are like a more innovative wave in Western democracies in which some democratic innovations are at the center. For instance, the citizens' assemblies elected by sortition are promoted as a mechanism to increase dialogue. I think the CAs are an interesting mechanism with a lot of potentialities, but in this conversation, I would prefer to stress that it's important to escape any form of technocratic design of tools, expecting these tools to work because are well designed. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but what I want to say is that social change needs to be based in the grassroots, in the civil society organizations that are fighting in the field, that are organized. And also, I think political parties need to be also in this conversation and in the table. There is an anti-politics discourse which is part of the problem, and we should never reproduce this discourse. Of course, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that political parties are working well and are a perfect institution. It just means that collective organization is central for any solution to be provided. And in this sense, if we think in institutions of citizen participation or civic engagement, it's important to take in consideration that all the actors that are playing in the field should be also connected to this conversation. And this is the only way in which these innovations could work.
If you consider the key differences between social and institutional change, and also how they might reinforce each other. Do you mind sharing your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, this is a very nice question. And also, I mean, particularly because it connects with the previous one, and I think it helps
Yes.
to understand at least my point on the topic.
Mm.
I think social change is bottom up.
Mm.
Of course, it's influenced by what elites do, by what the media, the education system provides. But at the end of the day, social change is bottom up in the sense that it's driven by protests, strikes, cultural shifts, and is something much more flexible and difficult to understand. I mean, we talk a lot about democratic culture, political culture, authoritarian culture, but it's very difficult to measure what exactly it means. What we do have in society is diversity and pluralism in any society. Sometimes now, I mean, people speak about authoritarian countries, and we do know that there are resistance also in these countries. And maybe there is people who is not actively against, but is not also actively supporting or legitimizing these authoritarian regimes. And the same happens in democratic regimes. So social change is something from the bottom, fundamental, central, but at the same time difficult to capture. While institutional change is in some ways easier to capture and it's more top down because it refers to laws, to policies, to forms in which courts are ruling and taking decisions. So when we talk about the key differences and how they reinforce each other, the second part is the most interesting because really it's difficult to think in institutional change as a top-down change without any social support. So there is always support. And this is something we need to observe when talking about feminist rights and LGBTQI plus rights, is that if there is a cultural backlash, is because some elites or populist leaders are to somehow provide an answer to the most conservative sectors of a given society. So resistance needs to consider also this complexity and engage, I think, in civic education and in civic dialogue more than in confrontation. I know that this is always challenging and difficult, but this is central. So just to provide an example, we can observe how feminist strikes in Latin America with the wave of Ni Una Menos promoted the approbation of several laws against gender violence in many countries in Latin America, but also in other places. And then we can also observe how institutions legitimize and amplify social demands. So I'm talking about the movement between these two. You know, we spoke about social change and then about institutional change. And the second example is South Africa post-apartheid constitution, which to somehow was shaped by the grassroots anti-racist movement, and then later on became a tool for LGBTQIA rights litigation. So we can observe how this at the end complements. No, it's a kind of ideally a positive relation and action to increase rights and protect rights.
If we can get even deeper into those real life examples, I'd love to ask you if you could share some insights on more local democratic movements and resistance strategies from from different parts of the world.
This is very interesting, and we can observe strong movements in different places of the world. Again, this is not new. Which is I'm a political scientist, and I have a bachelor also in communication studies, but I love history. And at the moment, I'm reading more and more history because quite often movements and trends that we may feel, or some of us may feel that are completely original and new, are not as new. And how all this interacts is, I mean, of course, there are always novelties, and history never repeats. This is false, although it's a very attractive idea. But there are some common patterns or some patterns that are productive to reflect on the present based in the past. And then also it's interesting to observe how all this works in different places of the world. So we can observe, for instance, how feminist movements in places so distant and different as Iceland or Korea or Chile are shaping some strategies that are productive to install the topics in a given society in some very successful cases, such as Iceland, to really provide a framework in which changes are like more protected or stable on time, or such as in Korea, where the feminist movement is becoming stronger and stronger, but facing also a lot of challenges, or Chile, which is a case in between these two. And let me focus a bit on the case of Chile, but I think the what I and many others identify as key in the strategy are relevant also for other cases. Chile, as some people may know, is a country is a South American country which is considered a stable democracy, and in 2019 faced a process of social demonstrations, which was a surprise for many people because it was a stable democracy with also a stable economy. However, inequalities, several inequalities, and also gender inequalities and the diversities was one of the issues for what many groups were complaining. And the feminist movement gained momentum in the protests in 2018, 2019, and was a key actor in the social uprising. And one of the central demands was gender equality. Then there was a process to write a new constitution, and in this process, the feminist movement managed to introduce a law in favor of gender parity, which was a complete novelty for Chilean politics. And the basement for the successful of this strategy, and yeah, many people may be thinking that the constitution was a fail because there was not a new constitution. However, the law on gender parity is still there, and there are a lot of advances in this sense in terms of political representation, not only for gender but also for other groups, including the indigenous groups. And the keys of the strategy, which I wanted to stress here, is coalition building, public advocacy, and legal achievements. In terms of the first, coalition building, the feminist groups formed alliances with politicians across the spectrum. So it was not only the leftist partisan groups which were originally promoting that, but also the females in the right wing groups, which also supported these claims for gender parity in the Constitutional Convention. I think this is important. The idea of coalition building is not only important for the success of the demand, but also for maintaining that. Because on the opposite, when the political, after an election, something changes and all changes again. This is the central importance of the coalition building. The second, equally important, is public advocacies. The feminist organization, such as, for instance, Corporación Humanas or Comunidad Mujer, mobilized public support and lobbied for legal reforms. The Red de Politólogas, for instance, was also a very active actor, providing information on why this was important for Chilean politics, how this could increase welfare for all the society and not only for the feminist groups, etc., etc. And then the legal achievement. As I said, the law is relevant. It's a top-down achievement which provides stability and opens new arenas for this fight. And of course, there is a fourth dimension I want to mention, which is the cultural influence. And I don't know if you know this, Anna, but Las Tesis was a group that we won like recognition around the world. This started in Chile, was a theater group of feminists called Las Tesis, that they wrote a song called Un violador en tu camino. Which maybe sounds to many people, because this was replied, for instance, I remember the Turkish feminist groups singing this in Turkish and in Spanish in Turkey, but also in many places in Europe, in many places in Latin American countries, and in Spain, in other areas of the world, because what's such a powerful message about the role of the state and about the role of society in the reproduction of violence against females, that also I think had a central influence in the recognition of this movement and in the recognition of the need for a change.
Throughout our conversation today, I really appreciate you so eloquently being able to deliver an overview of how the backlash interrelates with democratic decline, with a main focus on gender and women's rights, but also how that intersects with other areas of power, such as indigenous rights, as you mentioned, and also LGBTQIA plus rights. Do you have anything to add in relation to the LGBTQIA plus perspective of these movements?
Maybe, I mean, I'm not expert on that, but of course, it's a fundamental, central topic for our conversation on democracy. Democracy is about pluralism, and democracy is about living together. So I really think there are a lot of challenges in all this conversation, but at the core of this conversation should be or has to be no doubt on the protection of human rights. So I think all the conversation needs to start always from the idea that living together means respect pluralism, respect the rights of others, and respect the right to live in peace. And this maybe is what I can say in general terms. And in more focused terms, again, it's not a topic of my expertise, but I think inside the feminist movement and the sexual diversities movement, we also need to take into account that the conversation needs to be democratic and respectful. And in these times of regression and reaction, it's really, really important to keep this conversation within the progressive movements, which is not always the case, as we know. It is also creating a lot of tension in several countries.
It has been very illuminating to hear about the contrasting and shared aspects of democratic movements around the world. And as we wrap up, and drawing on the captivating insights you have provided us with during this conversation, I'd love to ask you about your opinion on what are then the most effective ways to push forward for gender justice, and what do you see is needed to do that?
Let me say, I'm working a lot on democratic innovations, and my feeling within this conversation on democratic innovations is that many actors, being in international organizations, NGOs, or scholars, are just looking, for a kind of magic solution that will resolve the problems. And this never, ever will happen. So what we do have as a solution is the traditional recipe of what has worked a long time, which is the strategic combination of grassroots organizations, coalition building, cultural activism, which helps to achieve victories for feminism along history. Of course, the law is important, and all this combination needs to be, we really need to go back to the design of strategies, which include different actors, which are not 100% in agreement in all, but yes, on the basics. So I think this is a strategy. We really, really need to build coalitions, to think in the cultural dimension, to promote dialogue, and to really look at the future generations also. Because this is an issue, as I said in the very beginning, the youth disillusionment with democracy, particularly the male youth, is a challenge, a big challenge, which we need to address.
Thank you. I appreciate you highlighting the need for building coalitions and acting in solidarity.
Yes, solidarity is the word.
Solidarity is the word. I think that's a great place to end our conversation. So thank you so much for such a thought-provoking conversation and for your astute insights. You've helped us connect the dots between democratic decline, the backlash against rights, and also the urgent need for new forms of civic action. I think that this conversation has made it clear that defending democracy today demands both creativity and persistence. And your research, of course, gives us important tools for that work. And so thank you very much, and we look forward to following your work.
Thank you, Anna.
And that's all for today's episode of Backlash Unfiltered, pushing forward for equality in times of change. For more information and resources, check the links in the podcast description. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.